what Paul really meant in Philippians 4, how to overcome anxiety before it takes control of your life. You have probably heard it 1,000 times. Maybe someone said it to you in a hospital waiting room. Maybe you read it on a card someone left on your desk during the hardest week of your life. Maybe you whispered it to yourself at 3 in the morning when sleep wouldn't come and your mind wouldn't stop. Do not be anxious about anything. And if you are being completely honest, there was a part of you that wanted to believe it, that wanted those words to land with the weight they were meant to carry, but somewhere between reading them and actually living them, something got lost. Because the anxiety didn't stop, the worry came back, the fear returned, and you were left wondering whether those words were actually meant for someone whose life looked nothing like yours. Here is what nobody told you. Those words were written by a man in chains, a man who had been beaten, shipwrecked, abandoned, and imprisoned, a man who had every legitimate reason to be consumed by anxiety, and who somehow wasn't. Not because his circumstances were easy, not because God removed every obstacle, but because Paul had discovered something about the nature of peace that most people spend their entire lives searching for without ever finding. And he encoded everything he knew into 11 verses of a letter written from a Roman prison cell. A letter that has been read for 2,000 years, memorized by millions, printed on more coffee mugs than perhaps any other passage in Scripture. But here is the question almost nobody asks. What did Paul actually mean? Not what does it sound like, not what does it feel like when you read it on a good day. But what was Paul, a trained rabbi, a Roman citizen, a man who understood Greek philosophy and Jewish theology with equal precision, actually saying when he wrote those words? Because when you go back to the original language, when you sit with the Greek terms Paul chose deliberately and carefully, when you understand the city he was writing to, the crisis that community was facing, and the specific words he used to describe anxiety, prayer, peace and contentment, everything shifts. The passage stops being a comfort quote. It becomes a manual, a precise, structured, counterintuitive manual for dismantling anxiety from the inside out, not by avoiding what is hard, but by learning to carry it in a completely different way. And that is exactly what we are going to do in this video. We are going to go word by word, concept by concept, through Philippians 4. And by the time we are done, you will not just understand what Paul said, you will understand what he meant. If that is something you need right now, hit subscribe and stay with us. Share this with someone who is carrying something they were never meant to carry alone. And drop a comment below telling us, what is the one thing anxiety has been stealing from you most? Because this conversation is just getting started. But before we get to Paul's solution, you need to understand where he was when he wrote these words, because that detail changes everything. Paul did not write Philippians sitting in a quiet library with time for theological reflection. He wrote it from inside a Roman prison, with chains on his wrists, not knowing whether he would be executed or released. And the church he was writing to wasn't doing well either. Philippi was a prestigious Roman colony, a city of military veterans, citizens with imperial privileges, people accustomed to order and control. And the Christian community in that city was in relational collapse. Two women leaders, Euodia and Syntyche, were in open conflict. Paul names them directly in chapter 4, verse 2. I urge Euodia and I urge Syntyche to agree in the Lord. In a first-century honor and shame culture, exposing a conflict that publicly was extraordinarily serious. This was not a personal disagreement. It was a fracture at the heart of the entire community. Roman imperial pressure from the outside, leadership division from the inside. And here is the second question. If Paul was able to write about peace and overcoming anxiety while imprisoned, surrounded by conflict, and under threat of death, what does that tell you about the kind of peace he is actually describing? There is a scene in the Old Testament that illustrates with stunning precision what fragmented anxiety does to a human being. Elijah, the same prophet who called fire down from heaven on Mount Carmel, who faced 450 prophets of Baal alone, who carried the voice of God across Israel, collapsed completely right after his greatest victory. In 1 Kings 19:3-4, we read, Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. He sat down under a juniper tree and prayed that he might die. I have had enough, Lord, he said. A man who had just witnessed supernatural miracles was now lying on the ground, asking to die because Queen Jezebel had sent him a single threat. This is merimnao in action. Elijah's mind was divided between who God had proven himself to be and what fear was whispering, and fear won, temporarily, not because Elijah was weak, but because he had disconnected his mind from the reality of God and locked it onto the reality of the threat. God's response was not rebuke. It was warm bread and fresh water, rest, presence, and then a voice, not in the mighty wind, not in the earthquake, not in the fire, but in a still, small whisper. 1 Kings 19:12. God did not eliminate Elijah's threat. He reunified Elijah's mind. And that is the third question, the one that will define everything that follows. What if the problem is not your situation, but the direction your mind is pointing inside of it? Because that is precisely where Paul begins his instruction in Philippians 4. Not with a promise that your problems will disappear, not with a guarantee that life will get easier, but with a command that sounds impossible at first, and that, once you understand what stands behind it, becomes the most liberating thing you have ever heard. There is a moment in Philippians 4 where Paul writes something that, if you are being honest, should stop you cold. He doesn't suggest it, he doesn't recommend it, he doesn't offer it as an option for people who happen to be in a good season of life. He commands it. Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. And Philippians 4:4 always. Not when things go well, not when the diagnosis comes back clean, not when the relationship is restored or the debt is paid or the fear finally lifts. Always. And in case you missed it the first time, he says it twice. Now, if you have ever been in the middle of real pain, real loss, real uncertainty, you know exactly how jarring that word sounds. Always. It almost feels dismissive, like Paul doesn't understand what you are actually going through. But here is what you need to understand about who is writing this. Paul is not writing from comfort. He is writing from a Roman cell, chained to a guard, facing a trial that could end in his execution. And he has the audacity, or perhaps the authority, to command joy, which means one of two things is true. Either Paul was completely disconnected from reality, or he had discovered something about joy that most people never find. The Greek word Paul uses here is cheret, from chara, joy, and the grammatical structure is a present imperative. That means it is not a description of an emotional state. It is an ongoing command, a continuous choice. This distinction matters more than most people realize. The theologian John Piper puts it plainly, joy is a duty, not in the sense that you manufacture a smile while your world falls apart, but in the sense that joy, in the biblical framework, is anchored to something that does not change, which means it can be chosen even when everything around you is in chaos. The Psalms understood this long before Paul wrote Philippians. David, in Psalm 43:5, talks to himself, literally argues with his own soul, and says, "Why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you disquieted within me? Hope in God. He is not waiting for his emotions to align before he decides to hope. He is commanding his inner world to reorient towards something solid. That is exactly what Paul is doing in Philippians 4:4. And here is the question worth sitting with. What would it look like in your life if joy were something you practiced rather than something you waited for? But Paul does not just command joy and leave you without a reason. He gives you the only foundation that makes this command anything other than cruel. Rejoice in the Lord always. In the Lord. Not in your circumstances, not in your health, your finances, your relationships, your plans. In the Lord. The preposition is doing enormous theological work here. F. Bruce, one of the most respected New Testament scholars of the 20th century, noted that the phrase "in the Lord" in Paul's letters is never decorative. It always points to a union, a positional reality. You are not rejoicing because life is good. You are rejoicing because of who you are in Christ and who Christ is in you. And then Paul adds something in verse 5 that is easy to rush past. The Lord is near. 2 words in Greek. Ho kyrios egus. Scholars have debated whether Paul means near in time, the imminent return of Christ, or near in presence, the constant proximity of God. And the most honest answer is probably both. But either way, the implication is the same. You are not alone in this. The one who holds the universe together is not distant from your situation. He is near. That changes everything about how you carry what you are carrying. And then, without pausing, Paul moves from the command to the mechanism, from the what to the how. And what he gives you is not a single instruction, it is a structure. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. Philippians 4:6. 3 Greek words define this structure. Most readers see one thing, prayer, and miss the precision of what Paul is actually saying. Prosouche. This is the broad general word for prayer, worship, communion, orientation toward God. It is the posture before the request. It is the act of turning your face toward heaven before you open your mouth. Desis. This is petition. Specific, urgent need. The word carries a sense of personal lack. It is the prayer that says, I need something I do not have, and I am bringing that need directly to you. Itema. This is the specific request itself, the particular thing, the name, the situation, the detail. Paul is telling you that God is not a general deity who receives vague spiritual energy. He is a Father who receives specific requests. Gordon Fee, in his landmark commentary on Philippians, points out that Paul is deliberately covering the entire spectrum of human need in prayer, from the posture of the heart to the acknowledgement of lack to the precision of the ask. Nothing is too large. Nothing is too small. Everything goes before God. But there is one more element, and it is the one that most people skip entirely when they are under pressure. With thanksgiving. Not after your prayer is answered. Not when you can look back and see how it worked out. With thanksgiving. In the middle of the petition. Before you know the outcome. This is where most people's prayer life breaks down under anxiety. Because when fear is loud, gratitude feels dishonest. It feels like you are pretending the problem isn't real. But Paul is not asking you to pretend. He is asking you to remember. Thanksgiving in the biblical framework is not optimism. It is not positive thinking dressed in religious language. It is a theological declaration, a deliberate act of memory that says, I have seen who God is. I have evidence of his faithfulness. And even in this moment, before I see the resolution, I choose to acknowledge that he is sovereign over what I am facing. It is what the Israelites were supposed to do in Psalm 77 when Asaph was in anguish and wrote, "I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your wonders of old." He didn't feel grateful. He chose to remember. And the remembering produced something that his circumstances could not. And that is the question that cuts to the heart of everything Paul is building toward. What if the anxiety you are carrying right now is partly the result of a gratitude deficit? Not a character flaw, but a disconnection from the evidence of God's faithfulness that is already in your history. Because Paul is about to tell you what happens on the other side of that prayer. What gets released into your mind when you bring everything, the fear, the petition, the gratitude, before God. And what he describes next has nothing to do with your circumstances changing. It has everything to do with something taking position at the door of your mind. In the ancient world, a city without walls was not just vulnerable. It was considered already defeated. Every major city in the Roman Empire, Philippi included, was built around the assumption that external threats were real and constant. The walls were not decoration, they were survival. And stationed at every gate, at every entrance point, stood soldiers, armed, alert, authorized to stop anything that did not belong inside. Now imagine that kind of protection, not around a city, but around your mind. That is not a metaphor Paul invented to sound poetic. That is a precise military term he used deliberately, knowing that every person reading his letter in Philippi would understand exactly what he meant. And what he is about to tell you about the peace of God will completely reframe everything you thought you knew about what peace actually is. Most people have memorized Philippians 4:7. They have it on a coffee mug, on a wall print, maybe tattooed somewhere. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Beautiful, comforting, familiar. But there is one word in that verse that almost never gets preached. And it is the word that carries the entire weight of the promise. The word is phrohesei. It is the Greek verb translated as guard. And it does not mean to watch over casually, the way you might keep an eye on something from a distance. Phroureo was a military term used specifically to describe a garrison, a unit of soldiers permanently stationed at a strategic point to prevent enemy access. Paul uses this exact word in 2 Corinthians 11:32, describing how King Aretas had the city of Damascus garrisoned to capture him. It is the same word, same image. Armed soldiers, controlled access. Nothing gets in or out without authorization. So when Paul says, "The peace of God will phrouresi your heart and mind," he is not promising a feeling of calm. He is promising a military installation at the entrance of your inner world. And here is what that means for you practically. The peace of God does not wait for your circumstances to improve before it shows up. It takes position first. It stands guard while the storm is still happening. This is where most people misunderstand the promise entirely and end up disappointed when they pray and still feel afraid. Peace, in the biblical framework, is not the absence of crisis. It is not the silence after the storm. It is not the feeling you get when everything is finally resolved and you can breathe again. Isaiah understood this distinction with striking clarity. In Isaiah 26:3 he writes, "You will keep in perfect peace those whose minds are steadfast, because they trust in you." The word for perfect peace in Hebrew is shalom shalom, the word doubled for emphasis. And it is promised not to people whose lives are easy, but to people whose minds are steadfast, fixed, anchored, in the middle of whatever is happening around them. Jesus said it even more directly in John 14:27, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid." not as the world gives. The world's version of peace is circumstantial. It depends on things going well. Christ's version of peace is positional. It exists inside the storm because it is not generated by the storm's absence. Think of it this way. A ship in a harbor is safe, but that is not what ships are built for. A ship is built to sail into open water and still hold together. The peace of God is not the harbor, it is the hull. It is what keeps you from taking on water when everything around you is chaos. That question deserves an honest answer. Have you been waiting for your circumstances to calm down before you expected peace, when the promise was never about the circumstances at all? And here is the part that makes this even more remarkable. Because Paul is not theorizing about military peace when he writes to the Philippians. He has lived it in their city. Acts 16 records what happened the first time Paul ever set foot in Philippi. He and Silas were arrested, publicly beaten with rods, thrown into the inner prison, the deepest, darkest section, and locked in stocks. No trial, no appeal, no certainty of survival. And Acts 16:25 records something that must have stunned everyone within earshot. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. Midnight, beaten, chained, singing. That is not psychological resilience. That is not a coping mechanism. That is phroesei in real time. The garrison of God's peace standing at the door of two men's minds, while every external circumstance screamed that despair was the only rational response. And the other prisoners were listening. Because there is something about a person who has access to a peace that makes no logical sense, that is impossible to ignore. What would the people around you notice if the peace guarding your mind was visible in the way you carried yourself through the hardest seasons of your life? But Paul does not stop at the garrison. He knows that peace is not only about what is kept out, it is also about what is let in. And so in verse 8, without breaking stride, he gives you the most practical instruction in the entire chapter. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. 8 categories, 1 command. Think about these things. The Greek word translated think here is logizomai, the same word used in accounting. It means to calculate, to reckon, to deliberately register something as having value. Paul is not asking you to feel differently. He is asking you to make a conscious decision about what gets processed in your mind. This is what scholars call the great filter. And what makes it remarkable is where Paul got the language. Words like noble, excellent, admirable. These were not exclusively Christian vocabulary in the first century. They were the moral categories of Greek and Roman philosophy. The Stoics, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Epictetus, built entire ethical systems around the disciplined curation of thought. Paul knew this, and he used it deliberately. New Testament scholar N.T. Wright points out that Paul was doing something extraordinarily sophisticated in verse 8. He was building a bridge between the best of Greco-Roman moral philosophy and the radically different foundation of the gospel. He was saying, you already know that what you think about shapes who you become. Your own philosophers told you that. Now I'm telling you what to think about, and why it works at a level your philosophers never reached. Because in the Stoic framework, you discipline your mind through willpower, through reason, through the sheer force of human determination. Paul is proposing something categorically different. The discipline is real, the list is real, but the power behind it is not human. It is the same God whose peace is already garrisoning your mind. And that distinction matters enormously because it answers the question that every honest person eventually asks about self-improvement and mental discipline. What do you do when your willpower runs out? There is one more thing Paul understands about the human mind that modern neuroscience has only recently begun to confirm. You cannot simply stop thinking about something by trying not to think about it. The mind does not respond to a vacuum. When you tell yourself not to worry, the worry gets louder. When you try to push a thought away, it pushes back. The only thing that actually works is replacement. Occupation, giving the mind something so substantial, so true, so excellent to engage with, that the anxious thought loses its grip simply because the mind is fully occupied elsewhere. This is not positive thinking. This is not the prosperity gospel dressed in academic language. This is obedience, structured, deliberate, ongoing obedience to a God who designed the human mind and knows exactly what it needs to function the way it was created to function. Practicing this filter is not a spiritual luxury for people in easy seasons. It is a survival mechanism for anyone who refuses to let anxiety have the final word. And Paul is not done yet, because he's about to reveal something that took him years of suffering to learn, something that cannot be taught in a classroom or downloaded from a sermon. It has to be forged. Most people assume that the great figures of the Bible were born with something the rest of us simply do not have: a supernatural calm, an unshakable faith, a natural disposition toward peace that made trusting God easier for them than it is for ordinary people living ordinary lives. And then you read the actual record, and everything changes, because the man who wrote, "I have learned, in whatever state I am, to be content," the man whose words have comforted millions of people across 20 centuries, learned that contentment the hard way. Not in a moment of revelation, not through a single transformative experience, but through a process so brutal, so prolonged, so relentlessly difficult that most people would have abandoned the faith entirely somewhere in the middle of it. And the word he chose to describe that process is one of the most quietly devastating words in the entire New Testament. In Philippians 4:11, Paul writes something that is easy to read too quickly. "I have learned, in whatever state I am, to be content." The Greek word translated learned is mematheka. It comes from the root manthano, and it does not mean learned in the sense of reading something in a book, hearing a lecture, or receiving a sudden insight. In the ancient world, manthano was the word used for knowledge acquired through experience, through practice, through repetition under pressure. It is the word used for an apprentice who learns a trade not by studying it, but by doing it, failing, adjusting, trying again, until the skill becomes part of who they are. Paul is not saying, "I received contentment as a gift." He is saying, "I was put through a curriculum, and the curriculum was brutal." You need to understand what Paul's life actually looked like before he wrote those words, because the gap between his biography and his peace is the most compelling argument in this entire letter. In 2 Corinthians 11:24-27, Paul gives a partial inventory of what he endured. 5 times flogged by the Jews, each time receiving 39 lashes. 3 times beaten with rods, once stoned and left for dead. 3 times shipwrecked, spending a full day and night adrift in open water, constantly traveling under threat, in danger from rivers, from bandits, from his own countrymen, from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in the wilderness, at sea, in labor and hardship, in sleepless nights, in hunger and thirst, in cold and exposure. This is not a dramatic embellishment. This is a man itemizing his resume of suffering. And now, from a prison cell chained to a Roman guard, facing possible execution. He writes, "I have learned to be content. Not, I was born this way. Not, God removed the hardship, and then I found peace. But I went through the school. I took every class. And somewhere inside the suffering, something was forged in me that could not have been built any other way." Have you ever considered that the very season you are trying to escape might be the one that is building something in you that no comfortable season ever could? Paul was not the only man of his era learning something inside confinement. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who ruled from 161 to 180 AD, widely regarded as one of the greatest leaders in human history, wrote his meditations not as a published work, but as private notes to himself, reminders, self-corrections. The journal of a man constantly at war with his own tendency toward anxiety, frustration, and the desire for control. He wrote things like, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." A Roman emperor, with more power than almost any human being who has ever lived, writing private notes to remind himself that peace is an inside job. The Stoics understood the architecture of the problem. They saw that external circumstances do not determine internal stability. They built entire philosophical systems around that insight. But here is where Paul goes somewhere Marcus Aurelius never could. The Stoic answer to suffering was endurance through reason, grit through philosophy. You discipline yourself, you remind yourself, you push through alone. Paul's answer is categorically different, and it changes everything about what contentment actually means. There is a distinction that Paul never states explicitly, but that runs beneath every word of Philippians 4. And missing it will cause you to misread the entire letter. Resignation says, "This is my life. There is nothing I can do. I accept it because I have no choice." Contentment says, "I do not need this to change in order to be whole, not because I am indifferent to the pain, but because what I am anchored to is larger than the pain." Resignation is passive. It is the spiritual version of giving up. Contentment is active. It is a daily decision to root your identity and your stability in something that circumstances cannot touch. The Apostle Peter understood this distinction when he wrote in 1 Peter 5:7, "Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you." The word cast is not passive. It is the same word used for throwing a fishing net, a deliberate, forceful, intentional act. You do not drift into contentment. You choose it against every instinct you have. And what makes that choice possible, what gives it actual power instead of just noble intention, is the foundation Paul reveals in the final distinction of this chapter. Read Philippians 4:7 and Philippians 4:9 side by side, and you will notice something that most sermons never stop to examine. Verse 7, "And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." Verse 9, "Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice, and the God of peace will be with you." Two different promises, and the difference between them is not cosmetic. In verse 7, Paul promises the peace of God, a divine gift, a supernatural garrison, a protection that stands at the door of your mind. In verse 9, Paul promises the God of peace, not a gift sent from a distance, but a person who comes to dwell with you. The first is a shield. The second is a presence. The first protects you. The second inhabits you. N.T. Wright, in his commentary on Philippians, describes this distinction as one of the most significant movements in the entire letter. From the experience of peace as something God gives to the experience of peace, as someone God is, dwelling within the person who practices what Paul has taught. And that raises the question that makes this personal in a way that theology alone never quite reaches. What is the difference between believing in a God who offers you protection from a distance and knowing a God who is actually with you inside the hardest moment of your life? Paul makes something clear in verse 9 that is easy to miss because it sounds like a condition, and we are often suspicious of conditions in grace. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice. Put it into practice. The Greek is presate, present imperative, ongoing action, not a one-time decision, a lifestyle, a daily repeated, sometimes reluctant return to the things Paul has been describing throughout this chapter. Rejoice. Let your gentleness be known. Bring everything to God in prayer with thanksgiving. Guard what you let into your mind. Learn contentment in the classroom of difficulty. None of these are natural. None of them come automatically. Every single one of them requires you to move against the current of your own instincts when anxiety is loud and circumstances are hard. But Paul's promise is not that the practice will be easy. His promise is that on the other side of the practice, not as a reward for perfect performance, but as a faithful companion to those who keep returning, is not just peace. It is the God of peace himself. You started this with a word, merimnao, a mind being pulled in two directions at the same time, a fracture so subtle you almost don't notice it until the weight of it becomes too heavy to carry alone. And now you know what Paul knew. Anxiety is not defeated by eliminating what you fear. It is defeated by replacing what controls your attention, by choosing joy before your circumstances justify it, by bringing every specific fear by name, with detail, without pretending it isn't real, before a God who is not distant from your situation but stationed inside it, by letting a peace that makes no logical sense stand guard at the door of your mind, by filtering what you allow to take root in your thoughts, and by learning, the way Paul learned, the hard way, through the very seasons you wish you could skip, that contentment is not something you receive. It is something you are built into, one difficult day at a time. Paul wrote Philippians 4 from a prison cell. He had no guarantee of tomorrow. He had every reason to spiral into despair, and instead, he wrote what may be the most psychologically and spiritually sophisticated passage ever composed on the subject of human anxiety. Not because he was immune to it, but because he had found something, someone, on the other side of it. Before this ends, do one thing. Identify one worry you have been carrying, turn it into a specific prayer, and find one reason, just one, to be grateful inside of it. Not because everything is fine, but because the God of peace is already there. Lord, teach us to bring you what we have been carrying alone. Guard our minds with a peace we cannot manufacture, and make your presence more real to us than our fear. Amen. If this opens something in you, if Philippians 4 looks different now than it did when you press play, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling us which part of this hit closest to home. And if you want to go deeper into what Paul really meant, because there is so much more, the next video is already waiting for you.